There's a lot going on out there, and businesses everywhere are looking at the large scale economic uncertainty and how it's affecting their businesses. But healthcare innovation and delivery is feeling the pressure from many different directions. Funding cuts, policy changes, global disruption are all happening at once, and they're making for a complex and fast moving landscape. So today we'll talk about what's really happening on the ground and how healthcare leaders can prepare and adapt to meet the moment. With us are two veteran leaders with deep industry experience from scientific research all the way through healthcare delivery. We have Dr. Tracy Veal, who is a healthcare strategist, and she's a Kissinger Group consultant currently working in Kaiser Permanente's innovation studio. Tracy has extensive leadership experience across the healthcare ecosystem, including payers, providers, pharmaceutical companies, and public health. And she's focused on driving innovation and strategic transformation within the healthcare industry. And we also have Dr. Marilyn Data. Marilyn is Group Vice President, Strategy and Business Development for the Bioproduction Group at Thermo Fisher Scientific. She is former researcher at Harvard, and she has had senior leadership roles across major life sciences and pharmaceutical companies. Marilyn is also a board member of the Elementary Institute of Science, which supports STEM education and community engagement. So thank you both for being here. I know we're going to have an interesting discussion. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus today on three major disruptors. The first is the impact of research funding cuts. The second is how the scientific and healthcare labor force is shifting. And the third is global vulnerabilities across supply chains and partnerships. So let's start with the downstream impact of research cuts. Marilyn, can you tell us a little bit about how you're seeing these cuts ripple through the system?
Yeah, sure. We know that basic research ends up in a lot of therapeutics. There's some estimate that 95% of therapeutics on the market actually originally stemmed from government-funded research. Wow. And some of the announcements about funding uncertainty, changes in indirect costs, so that's funding from grants that funds infrastructure and sometimes graduate programs and things at universities. And it's driving conservatism because people don't know exactly what's going to happen. Last Friday, in fact, the budget for 2026, the proposed budget was released, and there were huge reductions in basic research. So NSF would go down by 56%, the NIH by 40%. And as you think about that playing out in terms of research funding, it means that a lot of things that would be discovered or developed, it's not going to happen because they're no longer funded. And what we're predicting and what many are predicting is that it's going to slow discovery of new cures just because of that research funding. I think another thing people are talking a lot about is the fact that there are budget cuts at the FDA. And so there's some worry that there'll be delays in therapeutic approvals. We've seen a couple things. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal with some anecdotal examples of the FDA missing review dates. But honestly, it's early days to see how this is going to play out in terms of drug approvals. In general, less research funding is going to translate to fewer discoveries in therapeutics. And then there is concern that the FDA approvals may slow up.
And how long do you think until we see those impacts in terms of, like, when will it be to the normal person on the street? When will we see this happening?
It's a good question. I think in general, when you look at the number of approvals that happen per year, I would say it's probably 6 to 9 months before we'll be able to say, yes, this is definitely slower than last year, or here are 2 examples. So we're a little bit in watch and wait mode in terms of the actual therapeutic approvals.
Yes. Tracy, what are your thoughts on the topic?
Similar to what Dr. Dada was saying, the the funding cuts go downstream to the hospitals that do the clinical trials. And the clinical trials help support therapeutics for new drugs and adjustments to drugs that might meet a certain population, whether it's a female, whether it's an ethnic population. So it's almost like they're designed based on participation in the clinical trials, which happen at hospitals, academic medical centers. So when you eliminate a lot of that funding, their downstream effect of impact, not just to patients who are in the midst of those trials, but also to the clinicians and scientists and others that worked to support that. So just the devastation I've already seen and the mad scramble that physicians and administrators of academic medical centers and hospitals that are non-academic have had to do. They pivoted away from having to focus on clinical outcomes to having to focus on how do you even manage to save the jobs and the positions that were clearly needed in order to do certain impacts for clinical outcomes. So currently I've seen probably 20 to 30% layoffs, and that's early on. And that's without seeing what's going to come next. And that's based on the grant funding, because what most people don't realize is a lot of that grant funding goes downstream to the consumers, to the clinical and medical systems that impact the consumers on a daily basis. And then there's staffing and how a lot of people like myself, who was a postdoctorate fellow in public health, are able to help support with even a minimum wage a lot of that research. So that being eliminated will really impact particularly the underserved communities where we were just getting more people engaged in clinical trials to support population changes for a lot of underserved communities right after the pandemic.
So a lot of impact, both in terms of healthcare delivery, and you also touched on the workforce impact. And I saw a new survey this morning of executives at large companies. It was released by an employment law firm called Littler. 58% of the executives at these large companies that were surveyed expressed concern that new immigration policies will create staffing challenges. So I'm really interested in what you both have to say about there's a lot that's moving around. We've got talent on the streets, Tracy, that's great talent that may be out of work, have shifting immigration policies. So I'm curious as to, and it is early days, what changes in the workforce do the two of you anticipate? And Tracy, let's start with you because you've got us going with this.
I'll start with that one because it's very concerning. A recent survey by Science magazine indicated that 72% of the scientists are considering leaving the United States. That's a pretty significant number. It was horrifying to see it on the page, but we certainly understand why. And there are a couple of reasons. When you think about more than 30% of the workforce has immigrant visas, you can see that if they're at risk for being deported, and there's been random deportations of scientists and other people that are not valid, it's a risk to stay in the United States or even to consider coming here to do your research. So a lot of organizations in healthcare are concerned that when you think about the nurses and physicians, which is a high burden of people who come from other countries, and even the home health aides and in the nursing homes, more than 30% of their workforces are immigrants who have visas. So when you think about the sheer volume of people impacted and the ripple effect, we already have challenges in the United States with physician shortages, nursing shortages. So you look at that and the ripple effect and the potential that's already starting to show some signs is significant for who we will be able to care for and when. We don't want to go back to tent cities trying to help people like we did during COVID. And we will not have the clinicians to do that. And we will not have the clinicians in needed areas like rural areas, which in some places make up 70% of that state, where a lot of the immigrant visas people are stationed are physicians, clinicians, all those home health aides. And that is not something you can replace quickly. So the workforce impact is pretty significant. The threat of immigration and random selection by scientists who are actually have valid reasons for being here and actually have credentials. It's a concern to people who want to stay here and are considering coming here. So we're concerned about the talent pool because the immigrant population makes up a significant amount, and a lot of them came here for the research.
Yes. Marilyn, what are you seeing? Tracy's talked a lot about sort of the healthcare delivery side. tell us what you're seeing a little more upstream, or if you're seeing anything at this point.
Yeah, having been a researcher at one point, I have a lot of friends and circle and community of folks that are still in research. And as Dr. Beal said, there's a lot of researchers that are talking about relocating to other countries. And in fact, I just saw a campaign, I saw it on Instagram, and Europe has launched this campaign, Choose Europe for Science. And they're targeting US scientists to come to Europe. And they've set up a fund, I think it's $600 million over the next 5 years to bring talent to Europe. The one hand, people are starting to be like, oh, I'm out of work. But there's also specific targeting of, hey, come over here to Europe to do your research. And I think just picking up on the immigration point, there are hundreds of international students now in the US who have had their visas revoked. And there are some surveys out there showing that international students are rethinking even coming to the US for conferences because they're hearing these stories of being detained at the border or visas being revoked. And people have some very real fears about the immigration policies. And, you know, what I would say is when you look across our history, immigrants have accounted for an estimated 36% of total innovation in the US since 1990. And this is measured through looking at patents and things like that. And so one concern that I think people have, is there a mass exodus of talent? Are we not getting the inflow of talent because of maybe some of these fears about immigration policy? And that's going to create a lot of uncertainty. The other thing I saw recently is Francis Collins, who you may know ran the NIH for decades, very well-revered scientific leader. I just saw a video of him saying he's actually worried that there's going to be a generation of scientists that we miss out on because of some of these policies. So it's very fluid right now. I don't think anybody knows how it's going to play out, but some of the statistics that we just talked through, and it leads you to think that there could be a real risk here for both discovery, I guess, pharmaceutical, healthcare delivery across the board.
Right. And I suspect even though this is our focus today is healthcare, that will affect other industries as well when you talk about innovation and we think about technology and all the things that come out of that innovation. But we'll stay with our topic today. Let's talk, and we'll also get to some solutions here, but I do want to dig into what's happening globally with supply chain and partnerships and talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities that organizations are facing and perhaps what organizations can begin to do to protect themselves or to mitigate some of that risk. Yeah, go ahead, Tracy.
Yeah, I know we saw it during the pandemic. We were watching a lot of the changes in terms of we needed supplies, we needed personal protective gear, and we didn't have it. And a lot of that came from other countries like China. So one of the things that the learning is you need to look at all of your supplies to see where are you getting them from through your supplier, because if the tariffs come and you're looking at costs, can you afford to retain the current supply chain? In the hospital, we have everything from mobile mammograms and things like that a lot of the parts and things come from overseas. So to take an assessment to make sure that what you have and what you need to have on file or ready to go, you have that, because some of these tariffs will be devastating, particularly to nonprofit hospitals that can afford the added costs and they cannot pass them on to the consumer. That is not an option like it is in the retail space. So to me, the first line of defense is to assess what you currently have and to see where is it coming from and what is your supplier doing, because most of these supplies come from various suppliers. There's not one. And one of the things I've noticed is even when we go to where we get our supplies in, there's a lot of empty containers and not as much traffic. So I'm already concerned what's happening. Why don't we see the volume? So what is going to happen? And some suppliers are getting concerns about border crossings as it is. So I would say the assessment on where your key supplies are for something as simple like we had the protective gear issue, to make sure even things like reagents that you have to mix with certain things, we've been seeing changes that people are making to look at sterilization equipment, which is critical. And in some cases, recently we've heard of hospitals having to send someone somewhere else because they were part of a grant system that had certain staffing and they don't have that anymore, so they don't feel comfortable. So there's a lot of risk involved with supply chain that need to be assessed by whatever entity a person is in related to healthcare.
And Tracy, you talked a little bit about the assessment. What else can organizations do to, are we talking about regionalizing? What are some of the other ways that organizations can adapt?
Yeah, I think some unique collaborations, you might have to get in bed with quote unquote a competitor so you can share because you may be using the same resource. Or you might have a collaboration with a hospital overseas, like Mayo Clinic does a lot of collaborations overseas so that the folks who would normally consider traveling here, they're like, we're not traveling there. Now they have a collaboration where they can have their teams go overseas or work with the existing clinicians in the other countries. So you need to be creative about who you approach, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of approach. In addition to that, as we look at the supply chain, the other consideration is you need to be careful. And why I say that is because the FDA has been reduced in staff. There are a lot of FDA folks who would go overseas and assess the supply chain, the warehouses, those types of things. Those folks aren't here anymore. So we need to take a look at, if you do decide to go with an overseas entity for certain supplies, you need to make sure it's assessed for safety and quality if the FDA is not here to do those things.
Right. Marilyn, you lead and think about strategy. You also are in business development, so you're thinking about relationships, I assume, in all kinds of places. So what is your take on what's changing and how you see the organization adapting to that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And maybe just building a little bit off of what Dr. Veal is saying, I think we're going to see, after maybe decades of globalization happening, I think we're headed towards regionalization in many aspects. I'm seeing multinationals even regionalize between their different plants as to what their supply chain is. And one of the trends that I've been tracking lately is there's a lot of announcements about site builds and site expansions from the big pharma companies. So people like Merck, Eli Lilly, or where they have existing plants, they're saying like, hey, I make this in 2 places. I'm going to allocate more into the US plant, maybe because there might be tariffs on something that I make in Ireland, have to bring into the US. So I think there's a lot more thought by the pharmaceutical companies about where their plants are located. One concern, of course, is that it takes years to build and validate a pharmaceutical plant, right? It's 5 to 10 years is the estimate. A concern is if there are suddenly tariffs on pharmaceuticals, how long does it take them to get a plant in the US if they don't have one? And what's super interesting is just this Monday, there was a new executive order that came out, and it specifically targeted at asking the FDA to streamline the validation of new pharmaceutical manufacturing plants. So if you have, here's a problem, there's a tariff. Okay, we need to build a plant in the US. Ooh, that takes a long time. Then the new executive order is trying to address that. It's still going to take a long time. It's not going to be overnight ever to build a pharmaceutical plant. But you can see that this series of events is going to drive expansion of pharmaceutical manufacturing in the US, is the prediction. So just on the supply chain, like we could have a whole webinar just on supply chain.
Absolutely. Yes.
But I think the other thing that's really interesting that's going on, and I think about this in terms of business development and licensing, because I've thought a lot about licensing technologies in my career. What we're noticing is that when you look at the pipeline of pharmaceutical molecules, we break it up into things that are in clinical trials and things that are preclinical. And we are seeing a lot more preclinical molecules in China. And so we're seeing, and part of it's because of the investments that the government and that country has made in their 5-year plans. And I suspect there will be a lot of relationships and in-licensing of molecules from China into multinationals that will happen over the next couple of years. I think one way that companies are going to become more agile is that they will start to think about, where can I get new molecules and how much of a commercialization and manufacturing engine am I versus a discovery engine?
Yeah.
So that could be interesting, especially, like I said, as we see a lot more molecules, early stage molecules coming out of China.
So we may see
Yeah.
some companies change identities.
I think companies will have to reassess their portfolios as to what they can do during this time frame and prioritize what they can still create, because you can't do all things for all people as it is, but with the tariffs and assessing what countries are impacted based on your supply chain, I think there will be some skinnying down of what is offered, period.
Sure.
Totally agree.
And so when we think about the different, and we're looking at healthcare broadly, really
Mhm.
across the ecosystem. But when I think about the leaders who need to make really key strategic decisions right now, certainly we have people who are dealing with business development and those relationships. We have people who deal with supply chain and manufacturing. We've talked a little bit about HR. What else? Who else in an organization, anybody who's in strategy, but who else in an organization is rethinking, reformulating their strategies or undergoing major change right now?
For the health systems, the finance people are on the spot because as funding comes up and it comes down. So having a person in the room that helps with the analytics, and we actually can use AI for certain things, but it does not replace human decision making. And it can certainly lay out some options on the page. But at the end of the day, you still need the data scientists, and you also need the financials, and you also need to make sure you have a clinician, because I know for us, a lot of the tech devices, everything from pacemakers to hip knee replacements, will be impacted by this. So you have to make your list and check it twice and have a third party that's an analyst who can help do that, because everybody's tied to their particular item in the supply chain. So that's what I would say. You need to make sure you have both of those. And you also need to make sure you have someone who represents the consumer or patients, because they have a different perspective. We know we cannot pass on certain things, but what do the consumers have an appetite for if you have to make a decision? So consumer advisory teams provide great insight before you step into something and you made a decision that they may have said, here's another option. And sometimes they're very creative with solutioning.
I would also say, so I guess I would say two things, two areas of agility. I love the AI one. I'm an AI aficionado. I'm glad you said that. But I think one thing that's important, and one thing I tell folks to do as a strategist in times of uncertainty, is to kind of look at the areas that are uncertain and create a couple scenarios that could play out. And then say, within every scenario, are there some no regrets moves to make?
Well,
If X and Y happen, we always think we should invest in more plants. Okay, then that's something that should be on your roadmap to do. There may be other things that you're like, gosh, I am not sure. It's only in 2 of 3 scenarios. And then you should start to think to yourself, okay, what are the things I track? What are the signs that I may be going to this scenario where I need to think about that? And so I think that's very helpful in remaining agile in your decision making. You feel a little bit safe that you're no regrets moves, and then you're tracking key indicators of one scenario or another. That's one way that I tell folks to be really agile in their strategies. The other thing I would say is I think the idea of finance needing to be agile is very important, because as tariffs are shifting, the impact to sourcing and expenses is going to change. And so to really, as an organization, understand what expense position you're in and what risks you need to mitigate can help you with that decision making as well. It comes down to, do we have a financial model of what's happening in our P&L statement? And do we know how we need to react to that? So those would be 2 I would look at. It's just kind of scenarios and decision making, and then just tracking the financial picture and making decisions as you go.
right.
Yeah, and I would say similarly, we have this process we call a stoplight, red, yellow, green. What do we absolutely have to have, similar to what you said, but also what could we stop doing and not feel the pain the worst? Is like, if you stop drinking coffee, can you drink tea? It seems simple, but it's more complex, but at least get in the room with the team to figure that out first. So before any decisions are made, the must-haves and the low-hanging fruit. We go to the low-hanging fruit first. That's what we're doing right now, to just say, what can we not feel the pain of? Not the staffing, but the other things that impact the staff.
Sure. In terms of silver linings, do you see any silver linings here that may have short or long-term effects that are positive?
Oh, I do created some creativity. I remember as a student in Germany, I never would have thought of being there, and I could only speak German because all they were supposed to do at the university. So I see collaborations, not just globally, but locally that you wouldn't see. I remember when the hospital systems got together to be a purchaser all together instead of each one individually purchasing supplies of certain types, and it reduced the cost. I see people going back to that, where we're not focused on who's the competitor. We're focused on how do we get the best rate, whether it's things we have to buy overseas or things we have to buy locally. So I see creative solutioning where you have to get in the room with people you would not normally, just like the European Union has done with trying to attract our scientists. They've all come together, had their powwows, and everybody's divvying up who's going to attract who and who's going to pay for what. I think we need to take the same approach and do best case, worst case, and the medium scenario so that we do have a plan as opposed to woe is us. It's like we better move because this is moving fast.
It sure is.
I think the silver lining is that we do have to think broader. We have to think differently than we ever have before. And sometimes that makes you come to new solutions you wouldn't have otherwise. And when I think about the types of relationships people are going to look at, the fact that things are regionalized, if you're a multinational, you look at, wow, am I over rotated in relationships in one geography versus another? Is my KOL strategy strong enough in Asia Pacific? Right. And so by nature of saying, now I'm going to reach out, I'm going to get more relationships with KOLs in Asia Pacific, you're going to reach a diversity of thought. And so one of the key bases of innovation is diversity of thought. So you got to think at some level, it's going to generate new solutions we otherwise wouldn't have had. So that I think might be a silver lining that we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah.
People get more efficient and are very creative about it. I remember old fax machines, and now everything's virtual, but that wouldn't have happened without the changes that happen in technology. So it's the same thing.
Absolutely. Well, we need to wrap up here in the next few minutes. I'd love to ask you each if you could give one piece of advice to other healthcare leaders out there about what they should think about or what they might want to do. I'd love for everyone to benefit from your wisdom. So one thing, and if one thing is not possible, maybe the top 2 or 3 things they should be doing, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the start, stop, continuing activity needs to happen at all the levels of the organization because a lot of creative ideas come from the bottom up, not just top down. So the first thing is to get in the room and assess in terms of what priorities you have and how does that align to what's happening. Someone should come into that room and give prep to what's happening and the potential impact, and then let people whiteboard what do they think is the priority so everybody's on the same page about what decisions need to be focused on. You can't boil the ocean, and it's a short time frame. So that's what I would say would be the first thing to do, because what I'm hearing is a lot of people are waiting and see, and they need to at least start the first step and just go to the low-hanging fruit. What can we do to be more efficient right now? If we had to 911 this, what would we do? Rapid response team kind of approach. That's what I would say.
I love that. I think I would say you have to think about short-term mitigation, but you also have to think about long-term strategy. So short-term mitigations are some of the things that we've talked about in terms of the stoplight and the scenarios and really looking at your P&L and mitigating financials. But you also have to start to look at, in the long term, what is your strategic position today and how might it change given the market and segment changes that are coming? And strategy is all about choices. And so you need to think about, will the strategic position I'm in today ultimately be the one I need to be in tomorrow? And if not, what choices am I going to have to make in order to sustain my business for the long haul? So I'd say short term, long term, and no one has a crystal ball in the long term, but as business leaders, we all have to make decisions with the imperfect information.
And there's a lot of imperfect information out there right now,
Yes.
or a lot of information that's difficult to decipher. But so at any rate, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thanks to both Marilyn and Tracy for your time and your insight. And I'm sure that folks are going to get a lot out of this. Thanks so much for joining us. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to just drop them in the comments section. And if you register for this webinar, you will get an email with a follow-up resource from the webinar. If you would like that resource and you didn't sign up, you can sign up in the show notes.